Right, Sherwin, Bryce-Pease has been following this summit for us alongside the UN General Assembly meetings. Sherwin, that virtual summit now continuing behind closed doors after Biden's opening remarks. What more did the US president have to say?
Well, he's certainly trying here, Francis, to rally the international community, particularly richer countries, to really come on board in a way here to deal what is a glaring inequity around the world, something the UN Secretary General referred to as an obscenity when he addressed the United Nations General Assembly yesterday, really calling on high-income countries to deliver their own ambitious vaccine donations and pledges, following suit from the United States, the leadership role that certainly President Biden seeks to purport here in terms of this 1.1 billion vaccine doses. Pfizer-BioNTech, the one of the most effective vaccines that are currently in use, using this mRNA technology, and doubling essentially what he had promised at the G7 meeting in June, an additional 500 million doses, and really also talking about another goal being the dramatic boosting of global and regional vaccine manufacturing capacity. Of course, a huge focus for a region like the African continent that is suffering with very low vaccine penetration rates, current estimates at around under 4% of the almost 6 billion vaccine doses that have been administered globally, Francis. He also talked about building back better. He talks about this creating a new financial mechanism for global health security. I've also heard President Biden refer to what he calls a global health threat council. One imagines, based on a similar sort of iteration of what the UN Security Council does. Of course, the UN Security Council responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security. We're seeing suggestions now for a global council that will be able to raise the alarm if there is a pandemic type scenario as we are experiencing right now. This is also what he said, Francis, in terms of boosting regional capacity, mentioning South Africa by name. This is what the president had to say earlier.
Our Quad partnership with India, Japan, and Australia is on track to help produce at least 1 billion vaccine doses in India to boost the global supply by the end of 2022. And we're providing financing and helping strengthen manufacturing in South Africa and produce more than 500 million doses of J&J in Africa for Africa next year. And next, we also know from experience that getting those vaccines into people's arms may be the hardest logistical challenge we've faced. That's why we need to significantly step up our investment in helping countries get shots in arms. Today, the United States is also announcing that we're providing an additional $370 million to support administering these shots and delivery globally. And we will be providing more than $380 million to assist in the Global Vaccine Alliance, Gavi, to further facilitate vaccine distribution in regions with the greatest need.
So the goal here, Francis, is to get the global population to a vaccination rate of around 70%. That's what officials are talking about here. And in that room, I can tell you, although it's a closed meeting, I did see a flash on a screen. The EU Commission President is in the room. The WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, is in the room. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. President Cyril Ramaphosa was on screen. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, is there. And I imagine there will be a discussion about TRIPS and those TRIPS waivers, which are ongoing in terms of negotiations at the World Trade Organization in Geneva. And I imagine President Ramaphosa will certainly have a few things to say about that.
Yeah, and I'm sure happy with the mention of boosting manufacturing capacity here in SA. Sherwin, the UN Secretary General, not mincing his words yesterday in his address to the General Assembly on this vaccine inequity that the world is facing. He called it an obscenity, a moral indictment on the world. What is the UN's view on the long-term impacts if this pandemic is not brought to heel in the short term?
Yeah, he drew this dichotomy, Francis, between the success that has been achieved in producing these vaccines, a success in science, but giving the world an F on ethics in terms of the inequity that we are seeing in terms of distribution. And I think the main thread here for Antonio Guterres is that this is essentially an economic question. The longer this pandemic perpetuates these inequalities, the worse the economic situation will get for countries in regions where a vaccine penetration is low. The Secretary General talked about 6 divides yesterday, and one of those divides he mentioned is the divide between rich and poor, north and south. Often that means white and black. 70% of the population needs to be vaccinated, he said, by the first half of 2022. He talked about a lopsided recovery which would deepen inequalities. Rich countries, he said, could reach pre-pandemic growth rates by the end of this year. I think if you look at a country like South Africa, we know that is not going to happen, or certainly in the broader SADC region or in the African region. You're not going to see that level of growth, the return of tourism, the big fights you're seeing between the UK and South Africa on that score. You're not going to see a return to a pre-pandemic normalcy until vaccination rates get up to a requisite level. And I think that's the big concern here. The IMF, he pointed to an IMF projection that the cumulative economic growth per capita over the next 5 years in sub-Saharan Africa will be 75% less than the rest of the world. And when you talk about the development blueprint, the development agenda at the United Nations, when you talk about the SDGs, ending poverty, ending hunger, quality healthcare for all, gender equality, oceans, institutions, I mean, all those things suffer if you do not arrest this pandemic in the short term.
Yeah, an incredible number. Sherwin, we're running out of time, but very quickly, the UN General Assembly adopted a political declaration to bolster efforts to counter racism. And of course, that was a process facilitated by South Africa. Tell us more.
Well, rather than tell you more, why don't we listen to Catherine Labyrinth. She's from the Praxis Project, a social justice movement. She was the youth representative who spoke, and I think she encapsulates exactly what I might say. Watch.
I will not spend too much time here talking about structural racism and what it has done and continues to do to Black lives. I believe that you know. I do not need to attempt the impossible task of listing the names of the lives lost to police brutality. I do not need to tell you what the pandemic has done to Black and brown communities. I do not need to tell you details of what happens when a human is placed in a cage, whether it is a jail, prison, or detention center. I do not need to paint out to you what happens when you do not have access to clean water, clean air, nutritious food, and transportation. If you belong to the communities impacted by these atrocities, then you have felt it. It is a haunting that sits in your subconscious.
So in a nutshell, South Africa galvanizing the international community to reaffirm its commitments to those principles adopted in Durban 20 years ago. They've just adopted a new political direction to galvanize those efforts. And I think there, Catherine Labyrinth really articulating what we're trying to resolve here, Francis.
Thank you. Wrapping it all up for us, Sherwin, Bryce-Pease, SABC News correspondent in the United States.